these 11 chapters are asking us the question, are you willing to accept that you are a creature and that God is the creator? Or are you going to try to act like you're the creator God yourself? Part of the message of Genesis chapter 1 is, humans, you are late to the party. The God who made the universe doesn't need you, but he wants you. He wants you to have a friendship with him, which is ruined by you pretending you're the creator God, but can begin the moment when you admit I'm a creature in search of the creator God who made me.
Do you find the thought of reading the Bible too daunting? Have you tried to read it and fallen asleep? Are you convinced that the story of creation is just a lot of nonsense? I found someone who is so passionate about the Bible that you'll want to pick it up and give it a go. His name is Phil Moore, who has read it, studied it, written about it, and talked about it.
I really encourage people not to be too busy for the Bible. I know we live busy lives and so on, but this is the book for which more people have died in history than any other book.
I'm David Taverner, and in this series of podcasts, Phil is going to give us a sort of bird's eye view of the Bible, looking at the key themes that will be really helpful if you've wanted to read it but kept putting it off, or if you've started and need some pointers. That's why the podcast is called The Bible Storyline Simplified. And as we follow that storyline from Genesis to Revelation, we hope that each of our conversations will inspire you to give the Bible your attention. So let's start at the beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, just the first 11 chapters. What period of history do these chapters cover?
It's hard to know. Date creation, but certainly it comes to about 2200 BC. So this is charting what historians would call prehistory, so before the written record began.
Why have you called this episode Creatures?
Well, these are the first 11 chapters of Genesis and therefore the first 11 chapters of the Bible. And so it introduces the big themes of the Bible in these first 11 chapters. And probably the big theme which comes out here is the human tendency towards pride, which we can see all around us. We need no further proof that this is an issue still today. It's this issue of whether we are willing to let God be God, or whether we're going to try to be little gods ourselves. So this is events which took place well over 4,000 years ago, and yet these big themes are still the same today. Essentially, these 11 chapters are asking us the question, are you willing to accept that you are a creature and that God is the creator, or are you going to try to act like you're the creator God yourself?
But haven't you got to look after number one just to survive?
Well, it's interesting that the beginning of life doesn't begin with us. I know we refer to ourselves as number one, but the Bible kind of begins with a different story. The Bible begins with God, and it doesn't even present God as someone who is subservient to our judgment. You might have expected the first chapter of the Bible would be a great defense for the existence of God. How do we know that God exists? And then some of the best arguments that the Bible can put forth to make us believe in God. It just doesn't do that. The first 4 words of the Bible are, in the beginning, God. So you can disagree that God exists. You can say you're an atheist. You can deny it. But the Bible actually begins with the very assumption that you are not number one and therefore able, in a position to judge God's existence or non-existence. It begins with the assumption that God is number one and that you owe your very existence to his initiative, not your own.
You said that it covers these first 11 chapters cover these big themes. I mean, are there any bigger themes in life?
There are. In these 11 chapters, you'll get the big themes like love, marriage, having children. You'll have themes like infertility. You'll have themes like your conscience telling you you've done wrong and what are you going to do about it? You'll have themes like nation building, city building, trying to make a lasting name for yourself. You've got themes of the invention of alcohol and the first person getting drunk in human history. You've got these amazing themes in there, but essentially the ebb and flow of the human experience has generally been, not exclusively men, but normally men, thinking that they are like little gods and reaping the terrible consequence of that pride. And other men and women being willing to admit that actually we're not the key mover and shaker of the universe. We are creatures with a God who is calling us to live a particular way and to follow him in a particular direction. And so if I look back on human history over these thousands of years, there have been good periods in which to be alive and terrible periods in which to be alive. And a lot of that has been down to whether the people of that generation have decided that they will live God's way or not live God's way, whether they've decided to accept that they're creatures and therefore need to look to God, or whether they've tried to say, no, we can be little creator gods ourselves.
I thought the book of Genesis was about how the world began.
Yeah, well, that's how it begins. So the first 4 words are in the beginning, God, and then the next thing God does is create the world. So 10 times in Genesis chapter 1, you have the words God said. So God speaks and the world comes into being. 10 times God said, and then many times, and it was so. So you've got the first chapter of the Bible is essentially an account of the creation of the world. And what strikes you is that God doesn't sweat or struggle or find it hard to create the world. He literally speaks and it is so. So I think astronomers say there are at least 100 billion stars in the universe. It's hard to know the exact number. That's at least the ones that we can see. And in Genesis 1:16, for example, it's just 2 words in the original Hebrew text. In English, it's translated, God also made the stars. 100 billion stars in 2 Hebrew words. So you've got the account of creation, but you've also got an account of who God is as he creates. Theologians talk about ex nihilo creation, God creating the world out of nothing. Just the force of his word commanding things to be, and it is so. So the first chapter is indeed about the creation of the world and is really a declaration. God is the creator. Human beings, we are creatures. And actually the single biggest thing about our experience of this life and the life to come, Genesis will talk about the afterlife as well, the single biggest factor in our experience of this life and the life to come is how we as humans relate to our creator.
You use this word creation, but what do you mean by that?
Well, these opening chapters talk about the initiative of God to create the world as we know it. This is not a science textbook. It doesn't attempt to explain the how of creation. So sometimes people say, but science and the Bible, they contradict each other. They don't really. This first chapter of Genesis talks about the who, and the science textbook would talk about the how. And so I think that's quite helpful as we're understanding the word creation. In our culture, we tend to talk less about creation and more about nature. We talk less about creation and more about the universe. They're describing the same thing, but there is quite a subtle difference. One is talking about something not lifeless, but without a divine initiator. Nature, we talk about Mother Nature, but almost as a metaphor. Whereas creation, which is probably the way that throughout history most people have referred to the world, our generation's a little bit different, is this idea that the world you see is not merely coincidental or haphazard. The world you see is the initiative of some great divine being.
Does this part of the Bible talk about evolution?
No, there are some, people debate about this. It doesn't go into the how. So I think I've got friends who would read this and say it doesn't preclude the possibility of evolution. I've got other friends who would read it and would point to 1 or 2 verses and say, well, that doesn't make sense. But I think every scientist would say this, that we don't have all the answers. It would be a very proud scientist who said that by this point in human history, we know everything about the origin of the universe. The scientists that I admire the most are the ones who say the more we discover how little we've discovered. And so when you read Genesis chapter 1, it's not actually trying to give you a biology lesson. It's trying to help you to see what's going on behind the biology. So I don't think you're necessarily going to answer all of your scientific questions by studying Genesis 1 to 11. But I think you'll probably get answers to the bigger questions behind that. Not just how did it happen, but how on earth did it happen? Not just what were the nuts and bolts of it happening, but who initiated this strange thing that we find ourselves in a world where we don't just exist, but you and I are having a conversation now about the meaning of the world that we're in. This is a strange place to find ourselves in. And the more we discover about the how through science, the more it makes us want to understand the who of what's behind that science. So that's what Genesis is trying to do.
And you mentioned earlier that it's God at the beginning and human beings aren't there. So
right.
So how do they come into the picture?
Well, it talks about 6 different phases of creation. So it talks about them being days. Some people would read this Genesis chapter 1, and because it does talk about night and day, they would say this is clearly talking about 24 hours. Other people would read this first chapter of the Bible and say, well, we talk about the day of the steam train and the day of the printing press, and therefore it may be more than just a 24-hour period. In some ways, it doesn't matter. It talks about 6 distinct phases by which God makes the world and how he takes nothingness through to the world as we know it. And what's really fascinating about it is why this first section of the Bible is really about the creator and creatures, is we like to cast ourselves in the leading role in our lives and indeed in history. We like to think it all revolves around ourselves. What's fascinating about Genesis chapter 1 is that there are 6 days of creation and the first human beings don't appear until the end of day 6 of creation.
Right.
This is not God creating us early on because he needs a helping hand. Actually, part of the message of Genesis chapter 1 is humans, you are late to the party. The God who made the universe doesn't need you, but he wants you. He wants you to have a friendship with him, which is ruined by you pretending you're the creator God, but can begin the moment when you admit I'm a creature in search of the creator God who made me.
Now, most people, I suppose, have heard of Adam and Eve, but who were they?
Well, they're the people that are mentioned in these first chapters as the first man and the first woman. Adam is Hebrew for man, and woman is Hebrew for came out of man. So, this is pretty primitive stuff. These are the first human beings. These are the people who named the animals as we know them. And so it talks about Adam and Eve. It talks about what they did and didn't do. And certainly the rest of the Bible talks about them as real historical figures. And certainly Jesus and the Apostle Paul and other writers of the later parts of the Bible, they never hint at any point that these are mythological, typological, not really people, but metaphors. They're always talked about as historical people. So the simplest way to read these opening chapters of the Bible is that God created the human race by creating a man and a woman and saying to them, as he says in Genesis chapter 1, go forth, increase and multiply. And haven't we done well? 7 billion and still going.
But things didn't go according to plan.
No, well, this is the big theme. One of the big themes of creation is that Adam and Eve are made in the image of God. And it does strike you that they're similar to God, Even the fact that we're listening to this broadcast means that we have an interest in the meaning of the universe in the way the animals don't. There's not a podcast going on right now at the bottom of the ocean where dolphins are considering the meaning of life. It is quite uniquely human to be aware of right and wrong, to be aware that the world doesn't just exist, but may have some kind of meaning. And so we are made in the image of God in the sense that we have an awareness that is denied to the animals. In some ways, we're physically animals, but we're spiritually more like God than we are our pet dog or our pet hamster. However, what strikes you when you read about Adam and Eve is not just how much humans are like God, it's how much they're unlike God. So it says in the Bible that God never grows tired or weary, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 28. But clearly God made humans deliberately in a way that we do. After we've recorded this broadcast, we'll have to stop and have some food. I have to do that 3 times or more every day. It's weird that God never grows tired, but I can do very little for more than 2 hours without needing to have a break. Or it says in another part of the Bible, in Psalm 121, verse 4, that God never needs to sleep. We do. We spend 8 hours a night, if we're lucky, sleeping. We spend half of the 24 hours we have each day resting, eating, or sleeping. So you've got, even within the story of creation, this emphasis that we're like God, but we're totally unlike God. We're made in the image of the Creator, but we are mere creatures. And so this is the invitation God gives to Adam and Eve. He says, I want you to relate to me as creatures and not try and usurp my role as the creator God. Even the fact that he makes them at the end of the sixth day of creation. And there is a seventh day. God doesn't do anything on it. It's known as the Sabbath day. The Jews still keep the Sabbath day. The seventh day is the day on which God rested. And you think, well, he doesn't need to rest. You just told me that. Yes. And so Jesus explains in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, that the Sabbath was made for humans. In other words, the human experience began with a day of rest. It began with Adam and Eve eating fruit from trees they hadn't planted, enjoying a garden that they hadn't cultivated. And there's this repeated invitation from God, accept that you're a creature, that you're not the creator. If you will relate to your creator as creatures, things will go well. If you try and be the creator or pretend you're the creator, things will start going wrong. So as you say, things go wrong by chapter 3 of the Bible. Genesis chapter 3 is what theologians call the fall. You know, you've seen the famous religious pictures where you've got Adam and Eve in a garden, a tree, a snake tempting them, apple. It doesn't actually mention apple, it just says fruit of the forbidden tree. Okay. So it doesn't say that it's an apple. That's more of a medieval painter's license. But that's the issue, that Genesis 3 says the devil essentially disguises himself as a snake and comes to them and plays on this innate human characteristic we've got to want to be the star of the show, to want to be the hero. And so he begins with doubt. He says, did God really say you're not allowed to eat this? And then he begins by encouraging them to distrust what God said. He says, no, God's only told you not to eat this fruit because he knows that you will become like him if you eat it. In other words, he plays on this desire we have to not be the creatures, which kind of requires a bit of humility, but to try and make ourselves the creator, which is the object of our pride. And so having planted that doubt and distrust in them, he denies it outright. He says, no, if you eat this fruit, you will not die. But it's fascinating what happens when they eat the fruit of this forbidden tree. The bitter aftertaste is immediately the opposite of the rest that they've enjoyed on the Sabbath. Death comes into the world. Sickness, stress, pain, toil. We can all identify with these things. These are part and parcel of our daily lives. Genesis 3 says these are all part of our desire to be God and not let God be God.
Let's just go back 1 second to your mention of the devil. What's that all about? Where's the devil come from?
Yeah, well, again, the Bible doesn't really feel it needs to defend this to us. So it does talk about the devil. It talks about God creating angels. And, I guess people have talked about angels for thousands and thousands of years. There's many accounts of people seeing them. And it also talks about some of the angels rebelling against God in probably a similar way to how it describes Adam and Eve rebelling against God. They didn't want to be creatures. They wanted to be like the creator. And so it talks about the leader of those rebellious angels being called the devil, which is simply from a Greek word that means the one who tells lies. Or Satan is his other name, which is simply the Hebrew word for the one who accuses. And to be honest, that's the experience that human beings have had throughout history of the devil. He lies to people and then he accuses them that they're not good enough. So whenever we experience guilt or we experience insecurity, we're experiencing some of the fruit of the devil having tempted our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents in the Garden of Eden to try and act like they weren't creatures, but like they were the creator God.
Adam and Eve were told to sort of go forth and multiply.
Yeah.
They did?
They did.
And what was the outcome?
Well, they start multiplying after the fall, so after they've sinned. That's not to say that they weren't making love in the Garden of Eden, but they really get busy with trying to reproduce the human race after they've eaten the fruit, which means they're going to die. They realize the hard way that they are God's dependent creatures. They were designed to live forever. There was a tree in the Garden of Eden called the tree of life. If they'd eaten from that tree and kept on eating from it, God would have enabled them to live forever. They get banished from the Garden of Eden. And immediately after being banished, they start reproducing. It's almost like they realize our lives have a fixed length. We need to get busy with populating the human race. And obviously they did a great job. And we read about their children. 3 of their sons are named Cain, Abel, and Seth. And it talks about some of the things that they discovered about things beginning with God and not beginning with us. You see, Adam and Eve's instinct was to try and be the creator. After they sinned, their instinct was to try and be the savior as well. It says that in Genesis 3, it says that they made clothing for themselves out of fig leaves. It was the best resource they could find to try and cover up their nakedness. But what's really interesting is they're there, dressed in their fig leaves, in these clothes that they've made for themselves out of what's in the garden. And they hide. And God says, "Why are you hiding?" And Adam says, "I was naked, so I hid." So he's fully clothed in this stuff that he's made for himself, but he still recognizes how naked he is. In other words, he recognizes in that moment, it's not just that God's the creator and I'm the creature. It's that God's the only savior and that I need saving. And God helps him. God shows mercy to him in that moment. He actually sacrifices an animal for the first time in human history, first death in history. He sheds the blood of an animal in order to clothe them in the skin of this dead animal, which is the first prophecy that one day God is going to come into the world as the Savior. It's the first prophecy of the coming of Jesus, and that Jesus is going to die in order to save human beings. And this is the choice that faces Adam and Eve's children. So famously, Cain murders Abel. This is the consequence of not being willing to allow God to be the star of the show. If you're saying to God, "I'm not going to let you be the star of the show," you're certainly not going to let your little brother be the star of the show. And so Cain gets upset with Abel because he feels like God is happier with Abel than he is with him. Cain's basically trying to show off and impress God. And God's saying, I don't really need you to impress me. I just want you to admit that you've done wrong like your little brother, and I'll forgive you because I'm generous, I'm kind, I'm merciful. But can you just stop trying to pretend that you're the creator, Cain? And Cain's faced with the decision. Am I going to be humble, or am I going to rebel and slaughter my brother? So he kills his brother Abel. And so the human race then begins with these two great dynasties, what's known as the sons of men, the line of Cain, people who are trying to be the creator God, and the sons of Seth, the sons of God, they're also called. The dynasty of the child of Adam and Eve who said, "No, I'm going to let God be the creator, and I'm going to follow him as a humble creature."
The fact that there were just boys mentioned makes me wonder, well, where do we all come from then?
Yeah, well, I've got pet hamsters and they have no qualms about multiplying with their sisters. And that's definitely outlawed in the Bible as time goes on. But in the early days of the human race, I think we'd have to assume that Adam and Eve's sons and daughters multiplied together. That's how the human race began.
A bit later in this section in Genesis, there's this story of Noah.
Yeah.
Isn't that just a fairy story?
It doesn't seem to be a fairy story. Certainly Jesus didn't treat it as such. The apostles didn't treat it as such. Nobody in the Old Testament treats it as such. I think even it would be difficult as a historian to argue that that's a fairy story, because you've then got to answer the question, how is this story of a massive flood which wiped out the human race, except for someone who built a boat and saved the human race with some animals in it, how does that story pop up in the many divided cultures of the world? So in the Mesopotamian epics of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, these are some of the oldest works of human literature, it talks about a flood and a boat and someone saving the human race and the animals by getting into the boat. Or the ancient Greeks had the story of Deucalion. Again, a human being gets in a boat, saves the human race. The Aztecs of Central America have this story of a massive flood that wipes out the world, and a man builds a boat and saves the animals and the human race. The Aborigines of Australia, let's remember, these were not discovered by Europeans until the 18th century. When they discovered them, they discovered these people had a story of a flood which wiped out the human race and a man who built a boat. So it's really hard, even as a historian, to say this is just a myth, a fairy tale. When it pops up in all the great stories of the world, it makes far more sense to understand that actually something happened which is recorded in Hebrew writing, Greek writing, Mesopotamian writing, Aztec, Aboriginal. And here we have the account of Noah, which describes it in a bit more detail.
Just sort of summarise the story of Noah, if our only memory is of a children's story.
Yeah, so you've got these two dynasties of the human race. The sons of God, they're Seth's children, who are basically saying, we are going to be creatures and we're going to worship God as our creator. Then you've got the sons of men. These are the children of Cain, who are basically saying, we're going to try and be the creator. And for a while, these two dynasties live separately. It says the children of Seth call on the name of the Lord. Children of Cain never do anything. They're slaughtering people. They're boasting about how violent they are and how much they are in control of the universe. But then at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, it says something tragic happened, that the sons of men and the daughters of men married the sons and daughters of God. In other words, these two dynasties intermingled, and rather than those who wanted to be creator God being converted and accepting God's creator, actually the whole human race turned away from God, except for Noah and his family. It says in Genesis chapter 6 that he alone was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time. He alone walked faithfully with God. And so God says to him, I'm about to bring a day of judgment on the human race. This has happened throughout history, and each of these times that judgment has fallen on the world, it's a big prophecy that one day there is going to be a great judgment day. Again, lots of paintings have been produced of that. And God says to Noah, there is going to be a great judgment day. And the only way that people are going to get saved, and the animals even are going to get saved from that great judgment day, is through something made of wood. So he gives them the dimensions of the ark, and it says Noah made the ark just as God told him to. But you discover later in the Bible that this object of wood, which saves the human race, is one of the first prophecies in human history of the coming of Jesus, the man who would die on a wooden cross for the sins of the world. And so you've got this moment where it actually says that in the New Testament, it fills in some of the gaps in the story and says that Noah actually preached to his whole generation and said, I'm building an ark. I mean, it may have taken as much as 100 years for him to build this ark back in the days when there were no power tools and he had to gather these animals and so on. He preached for decades to the world, judgment day's coming. God is not going to put up with you pretending you're the creator God indefinitely. It's time for you to have humility, to come to God and admit you're a creature, that he's the creator God, that you need him to be your savior. And yet on the day when the floods come on the earth, only 8 people are in the ark, Noah and his close family. The human race essentially reject God. And the living world as we know it is wiped out, except for those that are in the ark. And then as the flood subsides, Noah comes out of the ark with the animals, the humans. These are the people that are going to repopulate the earth. And what's fascinating is, of all moments, this is a moment where you would accept someone to say, hey, I'm the hero of the story. I mean, we don't actually know the name of Noah's wife or some of the others in the story. He's like the huge character of his generation. You would expect him to want to be the star of the show. And he comes out of the ark and he looks at the massive job ahead of him, rebuilding society, civilization, repopulating the earth. He's got a to-do list like none of us. And the first thing he does is he puts down his hammer and his saw, and he lifts his empty hands in worship to God. In Genesis chapter 9, he essentially says to God, you're the creator, I'm a mere creature. We're restarting the human race over again.
So have we somewhat done this part of Genesis a disservice by turning it into a children's story?
Well, it is a great children's story. You know, what child doesn't love the story of, shipbuilding and animals? And, there's a reason why, many nurseries around the world have got a picture of this story on the wall. We've probably done it a disservice, though, by making it nothing more than a children's story. Essentially, this is a warning that the Creator God will not allow his creatures to rebel against him indefinitely. It's a warning that a judgment day is coming. And Peter, one of the disciples of Jesus, even makes the point in 2 Peter chapter 3, where he says that this is like today. He says, we're living in days when people laugh at the idea that God would ever judge the world. And he says, in the days of Noah, people also laughed. And we deliberately forget that story because we don't want to face up to the fact that there are consequences to our own rebellion. So I don't think we've done it a disservice by making it a children's story, but if all we do is relegate it to the nursery, we've definitely done it a disservice. It is a prophetic warning that God is the creator, that we are merely creatures, and whether or not we're willing to accept that is the single biggest decision any human being ever makes in life.
And to what extent was it a turning point in history?
Well, it was definitely a turning point in history in the sense that it was the remaking of the human race, although we'll find in the next episode that things don't carry on that way for too long. That although Noah begins with open hands saying, God, you're the creator, I'm a mere creature, you discover that even within Genesis 9 itself, he drinks too much wine, passes out naked, drunk. It's like, man, Noah, you're like the greatest man in your generation, and yet you can't follow God, for the course of one chapter. You begin to realize, even in Genesis 11, as the new population of the earth starts building the Tower of Babel and saying, come on, let's make a name for ourselves. Let's become famous. Let's build such an amazing tower that we reach heaven and people think these makers of the Tower of Babel, these are the great ones of the earth. You realize that actually there's something really deeply rooted in human nature, that we don't like to let God be the star of the show. We want to be the creator God ourselves. We really struggle to be humble enough to say we're creatures and God, we need you.
In the next episode, we'll look at the big theme that echoes through the rest of the book of Genesis, family, as God chooses just one family that will change the course of history. But there's a surprise.
God looks for a human family that will accept that he's the creator and they are merely creatures, and he looks for them at the very heart of idolatry, at the very heart of arrogant humanity.
Join Phil Moore and myself, David Taverner, for episode 3, Family, the next episode of the Bible Storyline Simplified, based on Phil's book, The Bible in 100 Pages. You can find Phil at philmoorebooks.com. Thanks for listening.